Welcome to Represent Australia Votes, looking at the issues that matter most to young people. Represent is SYN's flagship politics show, and we're partnered with Channel 31 and 1700 for this broadcast. You can be in the conversation too by Snapchatting, tweeting, or Instagramming us at SYN Represent. Now let's get straight into it. Our first topic is the environment, with reporters Millie Filler, Lucrezia Discontantino, and Declan Jones here with this report.
The environment has been one of the key issues in the past two elections. It is of particular importance to Australians as it directly impacts our lifestyle and our economy now and into the future. In the upcoming election, all major parties have come out with different ways of tackling environmental concerns surrounding climate change, renewable energies, Great Barrier Reef and funding to environmental research. All parties agree climate change is a threat and have committed to cutting Australia's emissions. The Coalition have committed to cut emissions by 26 to 28% on 2005 levels by the year 2030.
Our minus 26 to minus 28% for 2030 is one of the highest emissions reduction targets on a per capita basis in the world.
Labor wants to cut emissions by 45% on 2005 levels by 2030 and achieve a net zero emissions by 2050.
One way of reducing emissions is by taking advantage of Australia's capacity to produce renewable energy sources. In 2001, the Coalition introduced a mandatory renewable energy target with the initial aim to source 2% of the nation's electricity generation from renewable sources. In 2009, this target was increased by the Labor government under Kevin Rudd to 20%. Last year, both Labor and Liberal agreed to scale back the target, but the opposition has announced that it could seek to increase it again if elected. The Coalition has promised more than 20% of electricity will come from renewable energy sources by 2020. Labor is aiming for 50% by 2030. The Greens are aiming for 90% by 2030.
We want to move Australia quickly, all our economic sectors over to renewable energies. So we're proposing that 90% of our energy comes from renewable sources by the year 2030.
Wow. Central to a lot of Australians concerned around the environment is the conservation of the World Heritage listed site, the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is currently under threat from coral bleaching and water pollution from the actions of industries such as farming and coal mining. Prior to the last election, the Liberal Party committed $210 million to tackle issues on the reef, including runoff and managing coral bleaching events. The Coalition will also divert $1 billion over 10 years from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation for loans for clean energy projects.
This is to allocate a $1 billion fund from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which will be available for projects that will both reduce emissions, use clean energy and, of course, protect the reef.
Labor has announced a $500 million fund to protect the Great Barrier Reef through better research, coordination and environmental programs. The current Minister for Environment, Greg Hunt, is currently facing a court case brought by the Australian Conservation Foundation that challenged Mr Hunt's approval of the Adani Carmichael coal mine, alleging he failed to consider the impacts burning coal from the mine would have on climate change and the reef. The Queensland Labor government has approved the Adani coal mine, but Bill Shorten and the Labor Party has stated that if elected, a federal Labor government won't provide federal resources to assist the mine.
So the Greens recognise that it's really important to stop new coal mining in that area. So we've just had the Labor Queensland government approve the Adani coal mine, which will have a major impact on the Great Barrier Reef. We need to stop that mine from going ahead.
Central to all environmental policies is knowledge and scientific research, specifically from Australian institutions such as the CSIRO. The Coalition has cut $114 million of funding to the CSIRO, which has resulted in the job losses of 314 of Australia's leading climate scientists. The Greens have vowed to restore the CSIRO.
The Greens are proposing a $5 billion injection of funds into CSIRO. That'll reverse the $306 million funding cuts that were undertaken in 2014 and 15. So we'd reverse those cuts, the scientists can have their jobs back, and we will build our research and development sector in this country.
Labor has committed to investing $250 million in the CSIRO to ensure the future of key national scientific infrastructure, as well as the $50 million it had already committed to help the CSIRO protect the Great Barrier Reef.
We are now joined in the studio by reporter Erin Leader and our guest Phoebe Rowntree from the Australian Youth Climate Coalition.
Thanks, Alice. Hi, Phoebe. Can you explain a bit about the AYCC?
Of course. So the AYCC stands for the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. We're a youth-led organisation, actually Australia's largest, and we're focused on building a movement of young people to take action on climate change.
Okay. So we have the election, and after the election the government is either returned or we get a new one voted in. What's the first environmental issue they need to address?
Okay, that's a really challenging one because there are so many aspects to climate change that we need to see our government, whichever party it's made up of, take action on. But one of the really big issues that we're focused on in the AYCC is the transition to renewable energy. So we need a government that's going to make a plan to transition out of dirty fossil fuels that have served their purpose, move beyond that, get to 100% renewable energy. But a really key aspect of that too that we're focused on is this idea of just transitions. So the communities that are going through these changes, we don't want to just leave them out in the cold. We need a government that can actually support communities to go through this transition, reskilling, supporting them to move into this other industry of renewable energy so that no one suffers because of this change.
Okay. So we hear a lot about renewable energy in terms of cutting emissions. Why is that so important? Why is renewable energy so important?
Yeah. So renewable energy is so important because it's a clean option in comparison with what we're relying on at the moment as a predominantly fossil fuel, coal and gas industry. So if we can transition to renewables, it gives us one of the pathways to start bringing down the emissions that we need. And as probably a lot of your viewers know, emissions are problematic because of their link to global warming, which has a number of very detrimental effects in terms of health, environmental effects, displacement of people because of rising sea levels. If we can start transitioning to renewable energy and lowering those emissions, we start to tackle global warming.
Okay. The current government has pledged to cut emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030. Is that on par with the rest of the world?
It really varies depending on different countries. So Germany, for example, is doing far better in terms of their move to renewable energy through strong leadership. But the bigger question too is whether these targets are adequate, and 26 to 28% absolutely is not adequate in terms of the reduction of emissions. If you think too that Australia is one of the largest per capita emitters, we're also one of the sunniest country in the world and one of the windiest. So we've got this large amount of pollution that we're putting into the atmosphere and also the greatest capacity to invest in renewables, so we can really set way higher targets than that.
Okay, what sort of target would the AYCC consider acceptable?
Yeah. We're pushing for 100%.
Wow, okay.
We think, why not? You know, Australia is a country that has the capacity for this. We've seen already that there is a reduction in how much we can get out of fossil fuels. It's a finite resource. We've already seen closure to certain coal power plants like that in Port Augusta in South Australia. So why not make a plan to transition to renewable energy while we can?
Okay. So the Greens say they want to cut emissions by 90%. You say 100. What would it take to get our emissions cut by that much?
Yeah. So what we would need to do is we need to stop having new coal mines. That's the number one. And that's why the Adani project in the Galilee Basin in Queensland is such a ridiculous project to proceed with. You know, opening up that area for mining is just going to send our emissions crazy high. So no new coal mines for a starting point. Secondly, we actually need to start making a plan for taking carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, because we've already gone beyond levels that are safe for a habitable planet. So that's the second thing that we need to be looking at as well, is how do we reduce emissions from the levels that we've already received.
Okay. At the moment, Australia is still sort of in that mining industry kind of mindset, and we're starting to transition out of that. How realistic is it to expect to get 100% cut of emissions in the near future?
I think it's completely realistic, but it's not something that's just going to happen. We actually need to have a plan for it. So we can hit 100% renewables. You know, the Greens have got that plan for it. Labor's looking at hitting 50% by 2030, but we need to actually have a well thought through plan for it. And what that means is that we need to get our energy away from propping up fossil fuel projects and divert that energy and that knowledge into the renewable energy sector.
Okay, the package covered a lot about the Great Barrier Reef. We're hearing a lot about bleaching and warming. Can it still be saved?
The reef can still be saved, but what it needs is action right now, which is why this election is such an important time for the reef. What we've been doing in the AYCC is having conversations with people, engaging voters around, you know, this iconic Australian place, the Great Barrier Reef. Mm-hmm. So it can certainly be saved, but we need to start reducing emissions right now.
Okay, well, thank you.
And now on to our next topic. Reporter Alan Nguyen talked to the AEC about how we actually vote on election day.
Voting's confusing. It causes stress and mayhem. You place yourself in this state where you start to question everything about your life, from why am I here, or do I even have to vote, or whether or not you want to move to some mountain in the Himalayas and become a Sherpa. Voting is apparently essential to our democracy, so it is worth paying attention on how you would go about at a voting centre. We spoke to Diana Yetzi from the Australian Electoral Commission to find out more.
So the first thing to know is that there'll be plenty of election officials around, so don't be shy to ask for help if you need anything. The first thing is, after queuing, the issuing officer will ask you to the issuing desk and you'll be asked 3 questions. What's your name? What's your address? And have you voted in the election before?
So mistakes happen to a lot of us. So what if I'm doing my preferences but I make a mistake? What can I do from there?
Yeah, so no problem. If you make a mistake, you just get the attention of one of the election officials or approach the issuing desk again and you'll get a fresh set of ballot papers.
So do I have to go to a polling booth in my electorate? What if I don't know what my electorate is? How do I find that sort of information?
Yeah, certainly. So our website is a great source of information. So check on the website by popping in your postcode and you'll be able to see which electorate you're in. So people just have to be aware that if they're not in their home electorate, they might have to do what's known as a declaration vote.
And what if I can't get to a polling station on the day of the election?
Yeah, sure. So we do help out voters that aren't able to vote on the day. There's early voting. So if you're eligible for early voting, you can attend a pre-poll centre or you can apply for a postal vote.
So you see, going to a voting centre, isn't that all scary or disconcerting? But what happens when you leave? Votes will be counted by people called scrutineers after the 6 p.m. closing time. We don't need to go into the details about that, do we?
No.
Okay, unless you want to. No?
No.
So what else happens at a voting booth? Well, there is your quintessential voting sausage and the limbo to avoid how to vote cards from the political party. It is truly an exciting time. Wait, is that not copyright? It is truly an exciting time to be at a voting booth. In fact, some places even have fun and games too, such as the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House in Canberra. According to a Facebook event, there will be sausages, there will be mock elections, there will be badge making. Hey, when's the next flight to Canberra?
4:30.
Okay. So you see, sounds complicated? That's because it is. But here's one thing. Voting is important. Not voting is more offensive than wind turbines. You know? So, vote often, vote early. Play chicken and grab a sausage and be involved in democracy. It is truly an exciting time to be a voter. It is time to fight back. It is time
That's enough,
for
Alan.
07.
That's enough. That's enough. That's enough.
Now, Mahika Hedge, Simon Chitchery and Julia Palau have researched the policies of LGBTI from Labor, Liberal and the Greens. Here they are with this report.
Lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, intersex and gender diverse people face many challenges in Australian society. In fact, the LGBTI community disproportionately are affected by many mental health illnesses, including but not restricted to depression, anxiety, suicide and self-harm. They face legal issues such as the denial of same-sex marriage and complications with reproductive rights, including IVF, surrogacy and adoption laws. Health issues are also a concern for the community, particularly sexual health and access to queer-friendly health services. Access to hormone replacement therapy has been on the forefront for the transgender community, as well as a concern for the gender assignment of intersex babies at birth. With the upcoming federal election imminent, Represent takes a look at how LGBTI policies stack up for the major parties. In their 2015 National Conference, the Labor Party voted to maintain a conscience vote within the party until 2019, where all Labor members would be bound by party line to vote for same-sex marriage. Labor opposes the Liberal Party's $160 million plebiscite on marriage equality, believing that a conscience vote in Parliament would be the most effective way to legalise same-sex marriage. The party states that if elected, they will appoint a LGBTI discrimination commissioner. LGBTI Labor members contesting this election in the lower house include Sophie Ismail in the seat of Melbourne and former Army Major Pat O'Neill in the seat of Brisbane. The Liberal Party has made waves staying in favour of a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. Contesters of the move towards a plebiscite have voiced concerns regarding the impact on mental health of at-risk LGBTI people. Others, including many in the Liberal Party, believe that a successful plebiscite will give more legitimacy to any legislation passed on same-sex marriage. Hardline conservatives such as Cory Bernardi and George Christensen have made headlines with views against same-sex marriage and the Safe Schools Coalition. LGBTI Liberal members contending for the lower house seats in this year's election include former Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson in the seat of Goldstein and Jeffrey Winters, who is running in the seat of Sydney. The Greens Party supports same-sex marriage, however they are against the Liberal Party's proposed plebiscite, favouring a parliamentary conscience vote instead. Going for the long haul, the Greens pledged to expand the Safe Schools program and support IVF access and adoption rights for same-sex parents. The Greens also support funding of HIV preventative medicine and increase global aid to fund the UN program on HIV/AIDS. Jason Ball, standing for the Greens in the Higgins electorate, explains why he thinks being more inclusive of the LGBTI community has far-reaching effects.
Well, you know, the Greens definitely have been in support of marriage equality since before it was cool. You know, they have been supporting a suite of policies for the rights and acceptance of the LGBTI community for decades since their inception, you know, with Bob Brown as their leader, Christine Milne, who has been a tireless advocate for gay rights and the decriminalisation of homosexuality in her own state of Tasmania. You know, Sarah Hanson-Young, her first bill into Parliament was for marriage equality, so the Greens have a great track record in that space, and I'm really proud to be getting involved in that and adding to that debate.
We are now joined in the studio by LGBTI reporter Mahika Hedge and guest Claudia Long, community broadcaster and student journalist. Zach Ellsbury is a politics and German student at Monash University, and Andrea Duvel is a politics and economics student, and Justin Lee, a chemistry and law student. I'm going to jump straight into things with something that's been a hot topic within the media cycle, and that's same-sex marriage. Zach, do you think a plebiscite when it comes to same-sex marriage would be the most effective way to achieve marriage equality, or do you think we should be going for a parliamentary conscience vote?
I think that the plebiscite is a good way of going about achieving marriage equality because it provides a platform by which we can spread a very positive and very positive message towards the entire community, particularly to those which have not yet been permeated by the debate as we've seen it, such as in rural Australia and in areas which aren't so much engaged in the issues. And because we're spreading a positive message, we're able to counter the negative messages which would be spread by our opposition, which have been able to hopefully make people feel somewhat more positive about themselves and lift their spirits. Obviously, I'm not speaking for them, but it may do so, which I think is a good thing, which we can't achieve with a parliamentary conscience vote. Another thing about the conscience vote is we've got MPs which don't represent their constituencies on this issue, and with the plebiscite we're able to overcome that and to enforce this is our will and this is what we want to happen.
Keeping the trend with political hot topics, the Safe Schools Coalition has certainly raised a few eyebrows in the last couple of months. Andrea, what are your thoughts on the Safe Schools Coalition? Particularly, what kind of changes would you like to see?
Well, firstly, we have to recognise that the government has already instituted some changes, and they said it was based on a certain report. Now, there's a disconnect between the report and what has actually been done. And I think a lot of it is more about handling moral panic and misinformation that initiated this debate on safe schools, which has existed for about 5 years actually. So some changes, such as not advocating for particular politics, allowing some consent, could be potential things to make it more applicable for everyone. Cutting out lessons are very bad things to do actually, because some of these lessons which weren't found inappropriate should stay in the program because it provides information needed for these specific students. I would say that Safe Schools Coalition should definitely stay. If we can amend it, maybe take out some politics out of it, that might be beneficial for everyone.
The Safe Schools Coalition and marriage equality have definitely been at the forefront of many of our major political parties, but they aren't the only issues that young LGBTI Australians are facing. Claudia, what do you feel the major political parties are overlooking when it comes to their queer constituents?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is listen to what young queer people are saying. That's really important. I think that governments also need to recognise that their policy does not exist in a vacuum, so obviously it has an impact on real people. That's the purpose. And we've seen, unfortunately, that in the queer community we do have higher rates of anxiety, depression and very sadly suicide, and there's a reason for that. And that reason is that there's obviously still a lot of discrimination against queer people, and I think that it's interesting that we've been talking about these really controversial topics, which really shouldn't be controversial at all, because guess what, queer people exist, and we should be able to get married and we should be able to be, in schools without being deemed controversial. And again, that's the problem, is that politicians really need to see how their policy has an impact on how people even are viewed. Because this debate about safe schools even has kind of associated young queer people with things like porn, which isn't even it's not in the program. And all those associations have come out during this debate and they're incredibly negative. And I think I'm really worried that we're going to see more of that during the plebiscite, because you're right, it is certainly a platform for positive messages to be delivered, especially to communities that haven't, like you said, have not been engaged in this debate for very long. And I bet that there are young queer people in those communities, or perhaps queer people who are not yet out. And one thing that strikes me is that, yes, while there may be positive messages, I'm not sure about you guys, but when I'm criticised, I remember that a lot more than when I'm praised. And I think that that's something that might be of concern, as you'll be hearing incredibly negative messages about queer people and queer families, and that has a lot more sticking power if you feel alone and if you're not in a supportive community.
It's particularly important when we look at queer representation in our major political parties, which is something that's been on the rise in recent years in particular. But I think this doesn't negate the fact that we still have large majorities of LGBTI young people who aren't completely engaged in the political process. So, Justin, what more do you think we should be doing to make sure that young queer people feel not only accepted, but in a place where they can fully participate?
Well, I think the question of representation, I guess, in the political process is just really it's a bit of a tricky issue. I can tell for sure that young queer people do want to be represented, and they do have their own opinions and they have their own feelings about a lot of things. When we're talking about student politics, for example, they're overrepresented in in student politics. So there's the evidence that we've got this desire. It's just now about bridging that gap between ideas and action.
From his fancy desk with his fancy graphics, Max Steenkamp gives us a rundown about how electrics work and who we're actually voting for.
One, standing in his nicely cut suit, looking out over the waves of Sydney Harbour, dreaming of limitless jobs and endless growth. The other, scrapping it out down the fruit store, desperately trying to figure out the lettuce preferences of the average voter. So, which one will you vote for? Malcolm Turnbull or Bill Shorten? Well, unless you live in Maribyrnong or Wentworth, you'll vote for neither of them. Sorry. In Australia, you can't just vote for whoever you want to be Prime Minister. That's not how it works. In Australia, we don't vote for the leader. In some countries, you get to vote directly for the President, but in Australia, we vote for the person who will vote for the Prime Minister before they get stabbed in the back in the middle of their term. That's because we don't have a President, we have a Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister is elected by the people we elect.
Wait, hold on, slow down. Who do we elect then?
Pipe down, you. I don't see the Weekly's graphics giving Charlie Pickering lip. In Australia, we follow the common system of representative democracy. That's where the population is divided into 150 districts, which are commonly known as seats. You're an idiot. So, at the election, each seat decides between different candidates to elect one person to represent your area's interest in Parliament. The people who are elected are usually from major political parties, as many areas decide their interests are best served by one of the larger parties. However, often seats are held by other parties which a region thinks better represents them, like Clive Palmer's seat of Fairfax or Adam Bandt holding Melbourne. Sometimes, seats decide they want someone completely independent from the major parties, like that time the seat of Indi in Victoria rooted out the Liberal Sophie Mirabella and elected Cathy McGowan instead. So, when we get to the election, everyone votes for someone to represent them in their local area. Over the whole of Australia, we collectively elect 150 people to go into the lower house of Parliament. These are the people who decide who will form government. If there are more than 75 of one of the major parties, that's Liberal or Labor, they can form government. However, if no one has a majority, like in 2010, the major parties either have to do deals with third parties and independents, or we go back to the polls and do it all again. But when voting, we don't just vote for the House of Representatives, we also vote for senators. Senators are the check and balance for the House of Representatives, and they check over legislation proposed in the House before it becomes law. Senators sit for 6 years, which is 2 election cycles, so each election we toss half the senators out and replace them with new ones, or we re-elect the old ones. There are 12 senators from each state and 2 from each territory, which leaves 76 in total. Most senators are from the parties, and while the majority are taken up by either Liberal or Labor senators, they often don't have enough or a majority in order to pass legislation on their own. So, many smaller parties like the Greens often hold the balance of power, where their votes are needed in order to pass laws. At the last election, we saw many minor parties take their place in the Senate, which meant the government had to negotiate with senators in order to pass legislation. The government got so annoyed at this that when they called this election, they threw out all of the senators. So now we elect all 76 seats, and this is known as a double dissolution election.
Sosa and Shannon Schubert looked at issues facing youth when it comes to jobs and housing, including the 2 major parties' youth jobs programs, and how a change to negative gearing policy may affect first home buyers and renters.
Young Australians are currently 3.4 times more likely to be underemployed than their parents' generation, according to research by the Foundation for Young Australians. The rise in youth unemployment has led to both major political parties formulating their own plans to get underskilled and underemployed youth workers into the job force. The Path Youth Jobs program proposed by the Turnbull government promises to help 30,000 young Australians through a 3-phase job readiness program. The second phase, entitled the Trial Phase, is a 4 to 12-week internship where businesses are given a $1,000 incentive to take on an intern and additional wage subsidies if they hire the young person after the internship. Conversely, the opposition's Youth Jobs Connect program includes a 6-month work placement with the promise of an award-equivalent training wage and a fully funded Certificate 3 upon completion of the placement. Some have speculated that Labor's program is a response to union criticism that the Coalition's Path program is illegal. The Coalition plans to pay interns just $4 an hour, less than the minimum wage set by the Fair Work Ombudsman, on top of existing welfare payments. The Australian Council of Trade Unions calls the Coalition's Path Youth Jobs program an exploitative path to nowhere program. They say the Labor Party's program proposes a real job-focused placement.
They'll provide 6 weeks pre-employment training. There'll be a 6-month placement, and it'll be a real contract of employment. So in other words, it's a real job, and the benefit for the employer comes through the taxation system.
With decreasing job security, a lack of increase in real wages, and an increase in the amount of part-time work undertaken by young Australians, rising house prices are increasingly keeping the younger market out of the housing boom.
I think there is an increasing trend of young people who are seeing house prices continue to escalate faster than their own income is growing. And particularly in a period where there's a bit of softness in the labour market, so wages aren't going up at the same rate as house prices.
One of the main differences between the 2 major political parties in this election is Labor's proposal to confine negative gearing to new housing. Under negative gearing, which is mostly in property, investors are able to deduct any losses from their salary and wage income.
The proposals around negative gearing and the capital gains tax concession will be advantageous to young people because they'll take some of that competitive demand out of the market.
The opposition says negative gearing and the capital gains discount has not boosted housing supply and has encouraged construction of more new houses. Some say it's not property investors driving up house prices and therefore negative gearing reform will not fix housing affordability. Last year, more than half of new home loans went to investors rather than to people wanting to buy properties to live in. The Turnbull government has no plans to change negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. They say the key to targeting housing affordability is to increase the amount of housing to meet demand. Professor Jargo Dodson, director of the RMIT Centre for Urban Research, says a change to negative gearing policy would likely not have as dramatic an impact on the housing market as some believe.
I don't think that we're likely to see a particularly noticeable collapse in house prices if negative gearing was to be changed in the way that Labor suggests it will be. Population growth is still going to continue to put pressure on house prices. We're just taking a degree of competitive demand out of the housing market, but underlying demand will continue to be there.
Let's now go back to the studio to discuss this issue further.
Now we have Antonia Sosa, Shannon Schubert and Emma Fu talking to Joe Hurley from the RMIT Centre for Urban Research, Angela Spinney from the Swinburne Institute for Social Research, and Claudia Long, community broadcaster and student, talking about housing.
So we'll start our discussion today on both parties' proposed youth jobs programs in reaction to youth unemployment. So we'll start with you, Claudia. What is your take on both parties' portfolios?
It's an interesting topic to be looking at during an election because obviously jobs are a huge part of any election race. And this is where both of the parties, I think, really want to differentiate from one another because obviously there's a lot of rhetoric that, both the major parties are the same. And in this case, they're really not. In terms of the Liberal coalition jobs policy for young people, it's something called Youth Jobs Path, and we saw it unveiled in the May budget. And essentially what it is kind of like the internships that we at uni do almost, except that you're paid money on top of your unemployment benefit. So it's for young people who are currently unemployed. The coalition is saying they'll be able to give out 120,000 of those placements. Now Labor has hit back at them on that one in particular because they will not be paying, as far as we know, minimum wage, and obviously that is a very strong foothold for Labor. And so Labor has proposed their youth jobs program, which will only be 80,000 placements compared to the Coalition's 120,000 for Youth Jobs Path. However, it's going to be a 6-month placement for each person, and they'll be paid minimum wage. However, I'm pretty sure they won't be getting their unemployment allowance, but it'll be a 6-month internship at the minimum wage. So those are the main differences.
Okay. And is there either one that you think is going to be more popular or more viable with young people?
I can't obviously speak to how viable it might be in terms of, because I'm not an economist and I'm also not someone who can probably give you enough authority on that. But in terms of what young people want, I would guess that it might be the one with more money. Simply because young people probably aren't necessarily, if you're looking for a job, you want a job for yourself. And if you can't, if other people can't get jobs, not really your problem. But if you want to get one that kind of pays you a better wage, in theory, from what Labor is saying, again, I have to emphasise that's what Labor is saying, the coalition has disagreed with that, then I'm sure young people may well be swaying towards the Labor Party on this issue.
Definitely an interesting issue that we'll have to keep a look on. But now we'll move on to housing. Antonio.
Before we talk about Labor's negative gearing policy, the coalition's stance says increasing housing is the answer to rising house prices. What factors do we see contributing to housing affordability and affecting young people's ability to get into the housing market, Joe?
Look, it's a complex issue, Antonio. There's a whole range of factors that affect the ability of young people in particular to get into the housing market. And we've also got to be aware that we're talking about two types of tenure here, broadly speaking. One is renting and one is purchasing. So there's a range of factors. Certainly supply of rental housing and affordable houses for purchase is an issue. The more supply we have, the more that will have a downward pressure on prices in both of those sectors. So things that we can do to increase supply are important. But we do need to be careful about the kind of strategies that are talked about to increase supply, because it isn't simple. And I'm glad we're going to talk about the tax settings, because certainly they're one of the things that are restricting the entry points for first home buyers into the market. Another element that's often talked about is urban planning policy, which is about the rules about where we can develop and how, in what intensity, so they can restrict supply. But we don't want to overstate that influence, because there is a lot of opportunity for development in our cities, and also those planning rules have very important roles to play in making sure we don't detrimentally impact the livability and sustainability of our cities. The other factor I think that maybe Ange might want to talk about is the amount of social housing and housing for supporting the most vulnerable in an area, in our communities. And when we don't have much of that housing, a lot of those people are forced into the private rental market, which puts upward pressure on rental prices.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In Victoria, only about 3% of all the housing is social housing. That's housing that is public housing or run by community housing associations. So there's a real gatekeeping process in order to be able to get into that housing. You have to be very vulnerable and have very real demonstrable needs. That means, as Joe said, that people who perhaps traditionally were just on low incomes and would have gone into public housing previously are being pushed into the private rental market. They can't buy, they can't get into public housing. They're in the middle. But sometimes they're not attractive to landlords. So we're seeing some types of people who find it quite easy to get into private renting. They'll have income levels that are good. They perhaps have no children. They won't be too young. They won't be too old. They won't be single parent families. So they'll tick all the boxes and be quite attractive to landlords. Other people are much less attractive, but they're stuck. They can't go into owner occupation. They can't go into social housing. What do? It's a real problem for young people.
When it comes to housing, negative gearing is a topic not to be missed in this election. So, Angie, how does negative gearing affect the market, and also for the group of people stuck in the middle you mentioned?
Okay, thank you. Well, negative gearing is a way of people investing in housing. So rather than just using a house as a home, as a tool that we live in, it's become an investment. And not only that, but an investment in which people want to make a loss at in the short term. Because what they do is they claim all their income tax that they've paid from other jobs, for example. They can offset the losses that they've made on the mortgage and on the rental income.
Although education hasn't been in the centre of discussion for the major parties, it is an important topic not to be missed. Matthew Elmas, Rudy Edsel, Emma Fu and Yazuhar Oko looked into the different stances Labor and a coalition take when it comes to higher education policies.
In elections past, universities have served as political hotspots, but this year, things are different. Malcolm Turnbull's early election has coincided with exams, which has left many students with more pressing concerns than the July 2nd election.
Honestly, I haven't really been following the election. I've been too busy with exams.
But if you stick around long enough, you'll find that there are still bitter feelings about the Coalition's failed attempt to deregulate university fees. And whilst that plan has now been shelved, Education Minister Simon Birmingham says sustainability is still the government's priority.
We have a budget that this year is forecast to run a $36 billion deficit, that it puts financial pressure right across every area of government spending. Higher education is not isolated from that, and we need to make sure that it is sustainable in the future.
Alongside putting deregulation and other sweeping reforms outlined in the 2014-15 budgets aside, the Coalition has decided to undergo consultation with the sector, leaving little in the way of budget measures for higher education. The budget does, however, outline a plan to cut $152 million from the Higher Education Participation Program, which assists people from low socio-economic backgrounds trying to attend university. The budget also provides $10 million in extra funding to the Tertiary Quality and Standards Agency to build additional capacity to investigate and respond to developments in the higher education sector. In addition to the budget, the government also released a discussion paper in May as part of their consultation process. It raises the possibility of introducing a help loan fee for all loans, lowering the repayment threshold from those earning just over $54,000 a year to between $40,000 and $45,000 a year, introducing a higher contribution rate for high income earners, and recovering help debt from deceased estates. However, Despite putting full fee deregulation on the back burner, a 20% base cut to university funding remains on the table.
They want to change the balance and they want the government to be investing less per student and the student to pick up more.
Connor King of Innovative Research Universities Australia explains that Labor and the Coalition are offering very different higher education choices to voters on July 2nd.
The community has to decide in electing a government. If you elect a coalition government, then you're moving down the path that's where the individual should contribute more over time. If you stick with Labor, it's based on you pursue what you want to do, there's an amount charged to you, and if you're particularly successful, your income will be higher, you'll pay more in income tax, and that contributes back into the system.
Labor, on the other hand, have doubled down on increasing the number of Australians graduating from university.
And we don't support the deregulation of university fees. Instead, we've just made the hard decision not to look good and give the $50 billion corporate tax cut that Malcolm believes will drive Australia, but instead we want to make sure that working class kids from middle class backgrounds are not discouraged from going to university because of $100,000 degrees. As a part of their 100 positive policies, Labor have promised to increase the number of students graduating from university by 20,000 every year for 5 years. They'll also provide 100,000 debt-free degrees in science, technology, engineering and maths fields over 5 years. In addition, they'll spend $133 million over 5 years providing 25,000 teaching scholarships to new and recent graduates of STEM degrees to encourage them to become teachers, and increase government fee contributions to $11,800 per student by 2018. Labor have also committed to a number of measures outlined in the 2014-15 Abbott hockey budget. They include supporting the indexation of help loans to the Consumer Price Index, lowering the help repayment threshold from those earning just over $54,000 a year to just over $50,000, and ceasing the HECS help benefit given to those studying early childhood education and maths, science education or nursing. Increasing the number of Australians with university degrees is positive according to Mr King, who has an eye on the future.
The jobs that will be out there will require some sort of degree, and we need to be able to just keep meeting that. So by having this system where it now is that as people see the need, and between individuals, whether younger people or their parents and other reckon they need to go to university, or older people coming back thinking they need a degree, we can enrol them. So it's a good system.
As we've seen, Labor and the Coalition have fundamentally different higher education policies, but it will be the party who wins government on July 2nd that will be tasked with securing the future of tertiary education in Australia.
We're joined in the studio now by reporters Matthew Elmas and Yuzuha Oka, and also talking to Colin Long, the Victorian Secretary of the National Tertiary Education.
So, Colin, I was just wondering, does the NTU support the Coalition's proposed 20% base funding cut to universities?
Most definitely not. It would be a disaster for universities, disaster for students, disaster for the future of the country.
But the Coalition says that now that we have a $37 billion HECS debt that keeps climbing, public HECS debt, that we need to make the system more sustainable. What would you advocate for doing that kind of a thing?
Well, there are many ways to make the system more sustainable, but it needs to fundamentally remember that Australia is a much richer country today than it was when higher education was free. Now, I know the system has expanded dramatically, but the HECS debt is actually a substantial problem for the country because it is a major drawback for students who are graduating with large debts. This is a big problem in the US where student debt is now more substantial than the subprime mortgage debt was before the collapse of the housing market.
But if we're going to keep increasing the size of the sector, then surely we need to do something to curb this massive HECS debt so taxpayers don't have to keep bearing an increased burden.
Well, it's the students who bear the burden of increasing HECS debt. The fundamental problem is that we have a revenue problem in the federal budget, so that the continual cutting of taxes and the proposal to cut further corporate tax over the next 10 to 20 years would further undermine the government's ability to fund important things like higher education and shift debt further onto students. So the issue is about who pays for necessary public infrastructure like education. It's vitally important to a functioning economy, to a
Would you
functioning
advocate
society.
then that we should increase income tax so that we can help fund students getting university degrees?
What we need is a progressive taxation system. I would advocate that increases to corporate taxation. There's been a big shift from taxation on corporations to taxation on individual income earners over the last 20 or 30 years. That needs to change, and we certainly don't need a reduction in corporate taxation. That is already too low, so I'd advocate for an increase in corporate taxation, and certainly an increase in the taxation that multinational companies pay. Large numbers of them don't pay any tax.
Okay, so getting back onto tertiary education, I wanted to ask about the Coalition's now shelved full deregulation policy. The NTU's opposed that in the past, but now the Coalition have suggested a plan where they would deregulate fees for only some courses. Is that a policy the NTU could get on board with?
No, and we don't. Well, we don't support that because we think that this is the so-called flagship courses policy, which would lead to. They're talking about up to 20% of courses would be nominated as flagship courses, and where there could be an increase. Universities will be allowed to set fees for those courses. We think that will just lead to radically increased fees for particular courses, and we don't see why that's fair.
So moving on to the Labour's policy, they have suggested providing HECS-free STEM education degrees for over 100,000 students over 5 years. What is your stance on the STEM education and how it's compared to humanities, the degrees as well?
Oh, look, there's certainly scope for improved outcomes in STEM education, science, technology and so on. That's very important. It will be very important for the future of the country, for skills, for economic development and so on. So we welcome that policy, but I think it's necessary to make sure that the humanities and other courses and other areas of study are not neglected in that. But we do welcome that policy for sure.
And does it going to be moving more towards the future employment? Is there enough future employment? Because now science students are already struggling to get a job, and if there are people are pushing more towards the science and STEM degrees, are there going to be enough jobs there?
Look, the future of the labour market is pretty hard to predict these days, and you know the advancing technological changes and whether that will increase unemployment. So it's a big question. I think all we can say is that technological change will require higher numbers of students who are qualified in STEM. So I expect their futures are brighter than in some areas, that's for sure.
And we're going to be moving on to our next topic now on preferential voting. Thank you, Colin, for coming in today, and thanks to our reporters Matthew Elmas and Yuzuha Oka. Have you ever wondered why you have to number more than one box on your ballot paper? Or why do parties are so eager to give you how to vote cards? Erin Lido reports.
In some countries, winning a seat is as easy as getting the most votes out of everyone running. But not in Australia, because we have a preferential voting system in the lower house of Parliament. It means every member of the House of Representatives has to get over 50% of the votes in their electorate. And your preferences, the candidates you pick second and third and so on, might be used to get them over that line. It also means your entire ballot paper, not just your first pick, is very valuable. Let's go. So how does preferential voting work? Let's simplify this. Extremely. Say you have 3 candidates for 1 seat and 15 voters, and all the voters have listed their preferences in order from 1 to 3. Adam here clearly has the most first preference votes, and in some countries this would be enough to win him the seat. Except not in Australia, because now it's only the beginning. Remember, the winning candidate needs to get over 50% of the votes in order to win. So in this case, at least 8. Thank you. Get out. Okay, so to do this, we knock out Charlie, who has the least first preference votes. And All the voters that voted for Charlie first, their votes go now to the second preferences. So say 3 said Adam and 1 said Bess. Now Adam wins because he has 9 votes. Woohoo! So while that explains it, it doesn't really explain why people keep trying to give me their how to vote cards. So to explain that, say Charlie and Bess, they made a preference deal and Charlie agrees to ask her voters to make Bess their second preference. And then when we knock out Charlie, Bess would get all 4 second preference votes and then Bess would win, despite the fact that she only had 5 first preference votes.
So that's why parties make preference deals and carefully curate their how to vote cards. While most seats are decided by first preferences alone, second and third preferences could be the difference between winning and losing in tight marginal seats. A lot of people do use how to vote cards because it makes voting that little bit simpler, but it's up to you whether you want to use one or not.
The Senate also has preferential voting, but the votes are counted differently to the lower house, the House of Representatives. And to explain that, I have to explain this.
Erin, is that maths? Nope, do an abridged version.
Okay, that's fine. I'll put something up on Facebook. But the important thing to take away from this is that while you absolutely can follow one of these, you can just pick all of your preferences, not just the first one. It's completely your choice.
That's all we've got time for. Who will you vote for in the election? Remember to vote by the 2nd of July to have your say in Australia's future. Thank you to all of those who have been part of this broadcast. And a special thank you to those of you who are watching at home. Remember, you can continue the conversation on Instagram, Twitter or Snapchat @SynRepresent.